Hi, this is lesson 4-9, the development of a national culture. Remember, culture is your art, your music, your literature, what influences it, and how it develops. By the end of the lesson, you should be able to explain how and why a new national culture develops from the years 1800 to 1848. Our first key concept is explain why a new national culture emerges that combines American elements, European influences, and even regional cultural sensibilities. Remember, America has 3 separate regions during this time. Let's rewind. In the years immediately following the Revolutionary War, the American culture was focused on nationalism, this idea of national identity, who we were as Americans. We began to celebrate our heroes, painting portraits, many portraits of George Washington. The architectural style is also what we call neoclassical, with its links to Greece and Rome. The colors and the pillars and the domes to promote stability and the ideas of democracy and republicanism, just like Greece and Rome. By the 1820s, the national culture begins to shift. It begins to undergo some changes. Remember, there's a greater emphasis on the individual. Politics during this time period, we see the rise of the common man with Andrew Jackson. So during this time period, we also begin to see more of the natural world and nature, because during this time we're opening up into the West. So we see more of those elements of the individual and the importance of the individual, as well as the West. Our culture and our art and literature during this time period pulls from 3 different inspirations: American influences, European influences, and regional cultural sensibilities. Let's talk about American influences. Let's put this into context. What is going on during this time? During this time, economically, we have what is called the market revolution. With the rise of the textile factories, we have this people moving into cities. We have a new class of people, the middle class, emerging. We also, during this time, have Andrew Jackson and the rise of Jacksonian democracy. Finally, we have Western settlement during this time period, this great push of moving into unknown lands. So those are the American influences. European influences. During this time, period 4, in Europe, there is this notion of Romanticism. Romanticism doesn't mean, oh, I'm romantic and I love you, per se. It's more of the idea of an individual, a person, a human, embracing emotion and celebrating nature. So it's not romantic love. It's this idea of individual passion, individual emotion, and the celebration of nature. Finally, cultural sensibilities. The regions continue with their unique elements that make them the way that they are. In New England, you still have this idea of the Puritan work ethic and this idea of religion as essential. Even if you're not super religious, it impacts who you are. In the South, you have this aristocracy, the gentry, the planters. And in the West, you have the frontier culture. A great example of frontier culture is someone I'm sure you've heard of, Mark Twain. Mark Twain writes about the Western frontier. He writes about life on the Mississippi River, which, keep in mind, was the Wild West during this time period. Our final key concept is all about how liberal ideals from abroad and romantic beliefs influence our literature, art, philosophy, and architecture. In literature, this is kind of like the heyday of American literature. This is the literature that many of you are reading in your lit classes. How many of you have read Nathaniel Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter or heard of it? Set in Puritan New England, which is where Nathaniel Hawthorne. It's a very romantic piece in that it's all about emotion. The poems of Emily Dickinson are written during this time period. And James Fenimore Cooper writes the Leatherstocking Tales, which the hero, the protagonist, is Natty Bumppo. James Fenimore Cooper also writes The Last of the Mohicans, which is about the natives interacting with the white settlers during this time period. In terms of art, we see the celebration of the common man. A very famous American artist, many of his paintings are in the St. Louis Art Museum, is John Caleb Bingham. He paints, about the common man, about shipmen on the Mississippi River. He has a very famous painting called The Election, where it's just a county election, where it's just about celebrating American democracy and that the common man could vote. Also, there is a school of art during this time period that becomes very, very important. It is called the Hudson River School. Many of these artists went out into the Hudson River Valley, which is in upstate New York, and painted great, vast vistas of land, of man and nature, of trees, waterfalls. So you see a lot of that. In terms of music during this time period, which is also an art form, you have the music of John Philip Sousa during this time. Moving on to philosophy. Philosophy is the study of ideas. In America, we have a movement known as the Transcendental Movement. To transcend means to rise above. This movement shuns traditional religion in favor of an individual, of you going out in to immerse yourself in nature, to find this transcendent experience, to find a greater understanding of your place in the universe. So it's getting in touch with nature. Two very, very famous transcendentalist authors are Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, both of whom lived in New England. They were friends. They knew each other. Ralph Waldo Emerson writes Self-Reliance. The very name of it lets you know that it is all about transcendentalism and this American experience that you are self-reliant. Henry David Thoreau spends a year living in a cabin at a pond. The name of the book he writes is called Walden, because the pond is Walden Pond. And he simply writes of his experiences and how getting into nature has truly made him the person that he is. So those two men are the key figures of the Transcendentalist movement. And last but not least, in terms of architecture, we move away from neoclassical and we move into what is known as the Gothic revival style. If you can imagine Romanticism in architecture, that's what it is. It takes its inspiration from the Gothic cathedrals of Europe. The Gothic revival style is very, very ornate. Think of round cupolas and curlicues in the woodwork with spires, stained glass. So you move away from the classic simplicity of the neoclassical and into these larger, more ornate, and sometimes very, very loudly painted, I should say, houses and buildings. So as you can see, during this time period, American culture develops. You should be able to explain how and why this culture develops throughout period 4.